All right, so chapter 21. You might want to grab your Mounce textbook, and we'll refer to that here and there. All right, so your Mounce chapter is 182 is the page number. So what we're going to learn about are the imperfect active and the imperfect middle passive indicative tenses. These will be very similar to each other except for the endings that we use. We're going to form them the same way. Now, just a word here in terms of basics about the imperfect tense here. So take a look at the handout that you have. Everybody's got one? All right, very good. The imperfect is used for past time and portrays what Mounce likes to call continuous aspect. That's not my favorite term, but that is the one that he uses.
What would you say instead of aspect?
I would say aspect. I just wouldn't say continuous aspect. Imperfective aspect is the term that I would use. That's a grammatical term. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the aorist, but for now, we can say continuous. At least that'll get across the idea here. Now, the stem that we use for the imperfect tense is going to be identical to the stem that we're using for the present tense. Present tense and imperfect tense use both the present stem. So newsflash, there is no imperfect tense stem. And when we're dealing with the imperfect active, the subject is related to the verbal action as the doer, the agent. He was eating, for example. They were killing, and so forth. Now, what are going to be the component parts or the constituents of the form in the imperfect tense? First of all, we're going to have an augment, and this is new for those of you that haven't reached the imperfect tense in your Greek studies. The augment is something that's added to the front of the verbal stem to signify that you're dealing with a past time and therefore secondary tense. And that augment will usually be represented with an epsilon and a smooth breathing. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the other ways that the augment can show up, but we'll use that for now. That's going to come before the verb stem. If the verb begins with a vowel, then instead of adding an epsilon to the vowel at the beginning of the stem, we're going to lengthen the vowel. Okay, so that's another way to augment, and we'll look at examples of that in a moment. The next thing is the stem. Again, we're using the present active stem if we're dealing with the imperfect active indicative. Tense formatives, there are none. No tense formatives in the imperfect. Yay, right? Connecting vowel or theme vowel, thematic vowel, the same ones you know and love, omicron and epsilon. Same rules apply here. If our ending begins with a mu or a nu, use what? Omicron. Everywhere else, use the epsilon. And then the personal endings we're going to use, we're now moving to the right side of the quadrants for that master personal ending verb chart. We're using the secondary endings. And because we're in the imperfect active, we're going to be using the secondary active personal endings. So just a little illustration here of a sample form of the imperfect. Here is the augment, epsilon, followed by the tense stem. In this case, it's the present stem. The connecting vowel is an epsilon. And the personal ending here for the second person singular, that is a sigma. And sigmas don't begin with mu or nu, and that's why we're using the epsilon here. Okay? How would I translate this? Lu has to do with loosing. Epsilon tells me it's past time, and because I'm using the present stem here with no with no tense formative, this is going to have some kind of a past time but progressive or continuous nuance. So how would we translate that? You were past time loosing. Make sense? Lues, present active indicative, would be you are loosing. Okay, so it's a difference between are loosing, was loosing in our forms. Okay, so let's take a look here at the formation itself and how we'll actually see it all showing up here. first of all, you're going to see the augment plus the present stem here. So I've got all of those in your chart, the appropriate connecting vowels, and then over here are the real personal endings. Now remember, we learned the real personal endings for the present, me, ct, mente, and nt. Over here, the real endings and the secondary actives are very similar to me, ct, aren't they? What are they missing? Missing the iota. So it's mst, mente, which are identical, and then nt becomes just nt. Isn't that nice? Now, over here we have modified endings. Why are there modifications here? I think we talked about this a little bit the other day, but just as a reminder, why would the moo want to change to a nu? That's exactly right. You cannot end a Greek word with a moo. In fact, what are the ways to end Greek words? Nu, sigma, rho, the center consonants, or vowel, right? That's it. So what I should have had here for the first person singular would have been eluam, and then the mu, not being able to end the word, switches to its closest relative, its kissing cousin. Moos are nasal, right? And I want to get a nasal replacement for it. And since nu is the nasal that can end a word, we take that. All right? So eluam becomes eluan. And that is I was loosing. I was loosing. Eluan. Next, we have elues. Elues. Here, there's no problem. Everything's good. No modifications. We're all happy. You were loosing. Elues. Next, eluet. What's the problem here with the tau as the final part? Can't end a word. In fact, you remember a rule, don't you, about in your noun rules? A tau cannot stand at the end of a word and will drop off. So eluet becomes elue. Elue. And then you can also have that movable nu, remember? So you can get eluen. When you have a movable nu, let's do talk about this for a moment. Eluen, right? That movable nu could show up here. How do you know that nu there is not really a personal ending nu? Exactly. The connecting vowel has to be an omicron before a nu that's a personal ending. So it would have had to have been omicron if the nu were the real ending. It's not. It is just a movable nu. Got it? Okay. Next, first person plural. Oh, by the way, how would we translate eluen and elue? He, she, it was loosing. He, she, or it was loosing. Good. First person plural. Elua and adding men produces absolutely no problems. So we get eluamen. And the accent here does end up shifting to the upsilon here. So eluamen. Eluamen. Say that with me. Eluamen. So we were loosing. Add te. Eluete. And then we have y'all were loosing. Everybody eluete. And this is also a situation where that accent's going to slide over one syllable. And then the final one, eluant. Nu tau is my real ending. That begins with a nu, so I get an omicron. What happens to this final tau here? Yes, Greek throws in the tau, and we're left with eluon. And that does create a little bit of a problem for us, doesn't it? Because now our first singular and our third plural look identical to each other, and you got to pay attention to your context. Got to look for the subject. Or maybe the subject's not overt in the clause you're looking at. Then you have to look at the clause right before and ask, who were the participants in the clause prior? Because chances are, if there's no overt subject, then it's continuing the prior subject. All right? And so you want to know, was it I or was it they? Now that becomes difficult when you're parsing words because you have no context, right? So in that case, provide them both. And blessed will you be that you know them both.
Problems
Very, very, very rarely, because the context usually clarifies so much. Yeah. When you're doing translation exercises, sometimes you'll have that context, but sometimes you won't. And he's slicing something out of the text, but doesn't give you the prior sentence. And so then it is ambiguous until you remember, oh, yeah, in that story, Jesus' disciples are talking and not some single person saying, I was doing something. Okay, so these two forms are identical, but they are identical for absolutely, completely, and totally different reasons, aren't they? So it isn't that Greek's just trying to make it hard for you. Hey, let's trick, new Greek learners by making two forms identical. It's just that the phonetic rules are kicking in and they just happen to intersect at this point. Okay, so let's do some practice reading. Everybody, Eluan, Elues, Elue, or with the new, Eluen, Eluamen, Eluete, and Eluan. All right. So I want you to memorize this box here. That would be very helpful for your soul, for your spirituality, and for your Greek reading. When you do that, please do memorize these real personal endings in parentheses so that you can remember what they were and what they've become. Okay? This isn't as difficult as the present active or the primary active forms, right? These are fairly predictable once you know these matters. All right. Anybody have any questions? You're all happy? Okay. All right. So just a comment here about the augments. Under 21.10, section A, we are told here that if the verb begins with a consonant, the augment is an epsilon. So typically then we're going to see an epsilon, and the breathing will be a smooth one. Sometimes it'll be accented and sometimes it will not. And we've already seen that in our forms. Eluon, eluamen. You see that? You hear that? Okay, so if we have a consonant here, right, then we want to see that augment. This augment is going to create a new syllable, isn't it? Lu, elu. Lu, elu, right? New syllable's been added. And so this is often described as a syllabic augment because it's adding a syllable. And then the second way that you will see augmenting happen is if you have a vowel beginning the verb stem, then you lengthen the vowel. Okay? So situations like this, agapao is a good example. You see the alpha here on agapa. You can't just add an epsilon there, okay? That's not what happens. You may think that's what happens, but that isn't what happens. What do we do with the vowel? We're going to lengthen it here. What do you think this alpha is going to lengthen to? Yes, it is going to become an eta, all right? So we're going to erase that. That will become an eta. So agapa. And then let's go ahead and talk about this. If I were going to do the first person singular form, I loved or was loving, it would be agapa plus what? Well, before that, I'm going to get a connecting vowel and then my mu transformed to nu, right? And then, yeah, what does alpha omicron contract to? That becomes omega. That's right. Very good. And so this would be agapone. Okay, so agapone. That doesn't really look like agapone, does it? Not really, because it's been augmented. Now, when you lengthen the vowel, you're not adding a new syllable here. You're rather lengthening the syllable. In other words, the time it takes to pronounce the syllable that was short, now is long, adds time. So this is referred to as a temporal augment as opposed to a syllabic one. All right. So if you look on page 186, you see the examples here of which vowels will lengthen to what. He likes to go backwards. I don't like to do that. So he and I are different that way. Excuse me. But we'll just jot these down. So alpha, epsilon, and eta, all of these at the beginning of a verb stem, those are all going to be eta once the lengthening happens, okay? All right. So omicrons and omegas, those are going to be an omega at the end of the day. Short iotas will become long iotas, and short upsilons become long upsilons. Okay. In other words, you can't really tell the difference, but they're written the same. But these were short and they've been lengthened. Okay. So what does this reflect here on the left side? It reflects the kind of lengthening you see with contract vowels before you add the tense formatives. You remember that? So the same kind of lengthening there. Now, one final comment here. If you look at C, if a verb begins with a diphthong, either the first letter of the diphthong lengthens or the diphthong remains unchanged. Now, if the first letter lengthens, but you already know what the normal beginning is, you'll be able to see the augment there because it'll look different than what you're expecting. But what happens if you don't see lengthening? That is, what if the diphthong doesn't lengthen? As in the form hieriscon. Okay, hieriscon. Well, what would we do with that? How would you parse that? If you know the verb, you know this verb, right? Yes? No? Is this our first time seeing it, this chapter? Hierisco is to find. You guys remember Archimedes crying out, Eureka? That's the perfect active indicative. I found. Heureka. I found. So hieriscon, would you mistake that? Look at heurisk, right? And here we have heurisk. Would you mistake that for a present tense verb form? Why not? What's that? That's right. We are still looking at a secondary ending, right? That is not a primary ending of the primary the present. This omicron tells me that nu is not a movable nu. It really is a personal ending. And where do I have personal endings that have a nu? In the secondary side. And so that has to be the imperfect. The imperfect will use those secondary endings. Okay? So even if you don't have the lengthening of the diphthong, you still, if you're paying attention to the endings, should be able to tell. That's not a present, that's an imperfect. Okay? That makes sense? Alrighty. I think that's all I want to say about that material there. Okay, so on the next couple of pages of Mounce, you get the picture of the master personal endings chart here. And I just wanted to show this to you in toto. We had already talked about the changes here. On the right side are where we're going to see those personal endings for the secondary. Actives are always on top. Middle passives are down below. Okay? So we're going to be drawing from these for the next set of endings on the imperfect middle and imperfect passive.